So for this video, I'm going to talk about the readings for the week. As I said in the introduction video, which you should check out if you haven't seen it yet, the amount of videos per week might vary in length and amount, depends on the content, the discussion board, the reflective interpretations I see from you all. It's just, I want to engage you all with my content. So it will vary in that way. As I said, sometimes I might upload ahead, but many times it will be week by week basis. But I want to start by focusing on the readings from Gordon and Rousseau. So, Rousseau is a French philosopher, and what you read, or what you will read, is from the Discourse on Inequality. And Gordon's reading, Lewis Gordon is a Jamaican American philosopher who is talking about race and where race comes from. So, why am I starting a class on human nature with these two thinkers? It's because these two thinkers represent the two most dominant ways of understanding humanity in our current age, right? You really can't think through being a human in this world on a global scale without having some type of reference to two ideas. One is the idea that humans are individually free by nature. That's what Rousseau is going to talk about, and liberalism is going to talk about. Well, I'll explain what liberalism means. The other is that people are grouped and organized in their potential to contribute to society or do other things is based upon race, right? Race emerges in the 1500s, not too long from maybe about a century earlier than when these ideas of liberalism developed. But the two developed together to shape the major picture of the modern world. And so before we go into talking about race, let's talk about liberalism first. So liberalism is a political philosophy, and you should be very, very familiar with it because it's the dominant political philosophy in the world. There are some countries that are not strongly liberal, but most countries in the world have all drawn at least some things from liberalism. So liberalism was a radical shift in political thought, right? Prior to liberalism emerging and the revolutions that happened in the United States and France and Haiti, there was a sense that the king, at least in the Western world, ruled everything, and his mandate, his authority to rule came from God. That God basically had organized the world and led the flow of events to happen to the point that the king was ordained. And the king owned everything, right? Individuals didn't own land or property. You got it given to you, right? This is why we get the word entitlement from, right? Entitlements are now, when we hear the word entitled in English, the idea is that, oh, someone feels like they are owed something, right? Oftentimes that they didn't deserve it, they didn't work to it, like you're very entitled. Or there's a negative connotation in someone's entitled, that you just feel like you deserve it, maybe without effort, right? Even certain benefits like Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, those have been reframed, especially in conservative like media outlets, as entitlements. The idea being that these things aren't necessarily deserved. You're kind of entitled. You feel entitled to it in a way. That word entitled it's tied to the term title, a title, right? So an entitlement is something you get based on your title. So, for example, if you're the Duke of something in the monarchic system, well, that title, let's say you're the Duke of, I don't know too many regions in in England. Let's say you're the Duke of London or Duke of Manchester, right? I don't know if that really existed, but we'll say that as an example, right? Well, that meant that as the Duke of Manchester, you were entitled by that title to kind of manage that land. It belonged to you. And as long as the king liked you, or if he died and the next king took over, and that king liked you or wanted to support you, you could continue to have that land. And you could even pass on things to your children or other people. You can, and in fact, dukes could then carve out land to give to other people. That's where knights come from under feudalism, right? That the duke can say, hey, I want you to help defend me. In exchange for that, I'll give you some land. So I'll divide this land among 1,500 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people, and then you'll serve in my army, and then the peasants work the land, right? But no one owned anything, right? The king is the one who's ultimately owned everything. But a lot of people didn't like that idea, right? Some people made their way with it. I mean, they had, like I said, some people, families had land and they had power for centuries, such that even if a new king did come and didn't like them, sometimes it would be very tense. Like you don't want to make a certain person your enemy, right? But still, the authority rested with the king. And around the 1600s to 1700s, people started to think, is that really where the real authority comes from? Right? Is that really where it comes from? Just from God and the king? And so people start to have a different idea. And that idea we now call liberalism. Liberalism has the word liberal tied to freedom, being free. And so people began to reimagine what government was all about. And so liberalism asserts that humans are fundamentally free. It's in our nature to be free. And that all humans are fundamentally equal, right? So equality is guaranteed by human nature and freedom is guaranteed by human nature. That's a radical reimagining of what was people believed before. Prior to that, it was very religious or aristocratic, right? In which it was based on bloodlines. Of course, a person who is an elite person who's educated and learned and from a good family stock, of course that person's superior to a peasant, right? Why would they not be, right? A lot of people couldn't even read during that time. So of course, someone who's more developed, more has better etiquette and all these things is going to be a better quality person and deserve to have more power in society. But around liberalism emerges, that begins to change, right? And so liberalism has a few tenets, right? One, we said humans by nature are free. Humans by nature are free as individuals. But that means that the government then has a very special purpose. The government's job is to use enough force or coercive power to guarantee as much freedom and protect the rights of people, right? So this is where the language of rights comes in that we can't really think outside of, right? Everyone thinks of human rights. Everyone thinks that I have a right. You shouldn't violate my rights. It's wrong to violate a country's rights. We even know human rights. That's a statement about to say there's human rights is a statement about human nature. That there are certain protections that humans have by virtue of just being a human being, and the government's supposed to respect those. The rights are basically the boundary that the government has to respect, right? So under liberalism, the only reason the government can force you to pay taxes or go to jail, go to prison, or all the other things that it can force you to do, like force you to take your kid in certain kinds of ways, either homeschool to meet a certain curriculum or go to public school or private school, is because the idea is that the government's power to force people is necessary to preserve as much freedom as possible, right? In order to maximize the rights that you protect, to maximize the amount of rights you have, I have to be able to force other people to do things. One, to basically not violate your rights, right? If someone wants to kill you or attack you, that's a violation of your rights. And how are you going to stop that person if they're stronger than you, bigger than you, wealthier than you, right? More skilled than you? Well, the government can then say, hey, you stole from that person. Now I'm going to put you in jail. And that's going to protect everybody's rights. So part of the development of liberalism, right, was the idea that a certain different version of human nature, right? Oh, one other thing I want to say, another important part of liberalism is that individuals, one of the rights, the new rights, is owning property, which is a very radical idea. Very radical. Because as we said, before that, kings owned everything. There wasn't a sense that an individual, why should a peasant own land? Right? Why should a person who doesn't even bathe that often and can't read own land? Like what entitles them to own land? Like what have they done to be able to own land and say, hey, this is mine. You can't have it. Even if you're the king, even if you're a powerful businessman, you have to sell it to me or buy it from me or something like that, right? Well, tied to that was there was a different idea of human nature that was emergent, right? And that was that humans fundamentally through labor shape the land, right? It's almost like when you work land, your consciousness, your self, your inner human nature kind of fuses with the land. There's a philosopher, John Locke, argued this. And as it fuses with the land, it can belong to you. And that's also why it's a violation of someone's freedom or right? Part of that fundamental freedom is expressed in shaping, owning what you work the land to become. So part of this reimagining, this is where we introduce Rousseau, was this idea that, well, if everyone is fundamentally equal, right? Like as it says with Thomas Jefferson, right? All men, there's a problem there, which we'll get to later in the semester, but all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. And it's self-evident. You don't need to go to a book. You don't need to read of the Bible. You can see it with your own eyes, your own reason. You can see that we're equal. So there becomes a problem then, right? If everyone's fundamentally equal, how do we justify inequality? Why is there inequality? Right? If we're equal by nature, right? If there's nothing in my human nature that makes me inherently inferior to another person, why do we have inequality at all? Can it be justified at all? Right? Can we justify inequality if by nature we're equal? And so in France, this was a major issue for liberalism. There was a couple centuries where a lot of these ideas were worked out by various philosophers, right? And so there was an essay contest where they said, hey, who can come up with an answer to this question about where inequality comes from, right? If it's not, it used to be the idea that, hey, God just ordained it this way, right? It's the fate, right? You were born in a certain location, a certain place, you don't have certain powers or wealth or things like that. That's just what God wanted, right? God ordained it. Or there was the aristocratic method, aristocratic view, which said that you're inferior, right? I'm an elite, I'm an upper caste, I'm upper stock. We talk about in terms of good breeding, right? Good bloodlines. We talk about that stuff in certain circles. Well, that's the idea, right? Is that I'm genetically superior to you. Therefore, I'm entitled. I should have wealth and power and privilege and all these things, right? But if it's not those things, then why are we unequal? So that's where Rousseau comes in, and the essay that he writes, Discourse on Inequality, won the competition and still exists still exists through history to today. So there were two popular ideas about humanity that Rousseau wants to combat in the essay. The first, which he deals with most directly, is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes was a liberal theorist, but he was a conservative. He wanted to conserve the monarchy. He didn't want a democracy, a president and judges and legislative branch, all that stuff. Maybe some parliamentary stuff, but the core power had to remain in the monarchy. He didn't want a major change. But he recognized that these liberal values of freedom and representation and rights were important and need to be developed. So why do we need a king? Well, part of it is tied to human nature. Hobbes argues that humans by nature are reactionary, right? We react to things around us. We're not necessarily very thoughtful. His image of us is very mechanistic. Like we tend to react to things. Have you ever been made angry or hungry or very emotionally so stimulated that you couldn't stop yourself? Right? Impulsive, right? He says that's our fundamental nature. If we're not trained by civilization, we are reactionary and impulsive. And if we go back to our past before governments existed, we can see how awful life was for us. And this is where Hobbes, among some other people, introduced the notion of the state of nature, which Rousseau talks about in Discourse on Equality, which is the idea was what were humans like? It's a thought experiment. What were humans like before civilization? What's our pristine natural state as animalistic beings? And this is obviously before modern science. Now we have evolutionary biology and other things to think about to look at that evidence. But understand, I want you to think about these as thought experiments and see if they highlight something accurate about human nature, right? So Hobbes says in a state of nature, our reactions and impulses that we have under control, they're free, right? A lot of times, if you want Hobbesian views of the world, oftentimes post-apocalyptic TV shows or crisis catastrophe TV shows like The Walking Dead, Mad Max, that movie just came out recently, there's often a sense that once the law collapses, it's no holds barred. Everyone's going to be attacking people, stealing from each other, killing each other, betraying people. And if you don't really have your band of people together, you're going to get taken over, right? The Last of Us, that show just came out. A lot of zombie apocalyptic shows. You see people go crazy. Some people talk about that with some of the things that happened with the pandemic, where people just started buying toilet paper in massive amounts and getting in fights with each other and all kinds of stuff. Hobbes is saying that's our true nature. Without civilization, that's what we are. Right? That's another way to think of the state of nature idea, is saying, what is a human like outside of the bounds of sociality, of civilization? Not necessarily when we talk about primitive. Now, they would say that primitive societies are like this, but even primitive societies have social hierarchy and sociality. But if you take a human and somehow, if we took them and somehow removed the social webs we built and just had humans together, what would they be like? Right? So Hobbes says life would be, prior to the development of government, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Right? Because if someone wants something from you, they'll just take it from you. Someone wants to enslave you, they'll just beat you. Right? And so what happens is that society gets ruled by the strongest person. Someone comes big, powerful in some kind of way and just dominates everyone around them until they get defeated. Right? It's almost like when you look at how certain animals live, right? Like the lion pride, right? The king of the pride he's with, he's in control until younger males come and defeat him, right? A certain tiger or elephant might have a big swath of territory and he's constantly challenged. Deer, elk, all that kind of stuff. They're constantly challenged and the winner gets control over the territory, right? So he says that's what humans are basically like. We're impulsive, we're aggressive, we're reactionary. We don't really have ourselves in check or control, and the most powerful person rules us, and it's horrible. So he says basically the people came together to say, we're tired of this. Let's have some rules that we all agree upon that are the best for us. But we need a big, strong person to embody our will, to embody our collective desires. And that person is the king. So Hobbes changes it from saying that the mandate comes from God down like a beam of light that makes the king have his power, so that it comes from the bottom up. Right? The people say, hey, we need a centralized person who has enough authority to really enforce a rigid, like a controlled, secure social order. And so he says that's why we can't get rid of the king, because we need that strong central power. Right? Now, that's Hobbes' vision of the world. That's the one Rousseau refutes the most. The other one is Locke, who mentioned talking about property. Now, Locke's view was called tabula rasa. And tabula rasa was the idea that humans are born, as that term means, blank slate. They have no, there's nothing in you automatically. You're you're like clay that's molded by your experiences. Like you're impressed upon. You know, someone says, you made an impression upon me, or something impressed me in a way, right? He takes that very seriously. Now it is like your experiences mold what you are, like clay, right? And shape you into your personality. So if baby's born, they don't really have any inclinations. It's the social, it's their life, society experiences that shape who they are. Now Rousseau has a different idea. Rousseau argues that humans by nature are independent and compassionate. Independent, he means that humans by nature are self-sufficient. We can take care of ourselves. We can feed ourselves. He imagines us as very individualistic, not living in communities, right? That basically in him, in the state of nature, before civilization, the primitive, most primitive level of human beings, 500,000 years ago, right? We're just wandering around doing our own thing. We don't live together in collectives, but we can take care of ourselves. I can feed myself. If I hurt myself, I can heal myself in the sense of maybe not as good as modern medicine, but I can find maybe certain herbs or certain types of things to take care of myself. And if I can't take care of myself, I die, right? So he says we're basically self-sufficient. We're free. This is him. He's like, if we're free by nature, this is how he envisions our freedom looking like, because we're not bound by any restrictions or things to make us do something by other people. He says, for example, like slavery or other things, that if I want to force you to do something in the state of nature, like he says, Hobbes makes it seem really easy that some strong person can take over people. But how's he going to get the first few people, right? Because he's like, I literally would have to, he says, if I want to enslave somebody, I literally have to force them and watch them at all times because they could run away at any time, right? So it's very hard for actually some brute person to just show up and beat people into enough people into submission to have a mob and then take over and rule and that kind of thing, right? The second thing he says that we're naturally compassionate. And what he means by that is that for Rousseau, empathy is the most fundamental human emotion, not impulsive reactionariness, but empathy. He says you don't have to train someone to, when they see another person suffering, to feel something inside themselves, to feel, oh man, that's sad. Right? It's a natural reaction. It's a natural thing that we feel, right? And so for him, compassion is our most basic emotion, our most basic human emotion, I'll put it that way, right? To be able to feel sympathy for our fellow human beings. That's our most core human emotion, right? And so he says a lot more things in this text, right? But there becomes the question, well, if we're naturally independent and naturally compassionate, how do we end up with inequality, right? Well, he says there's a couple of things. The first thing is that human beings have another quality. So I said there's two, but I lied. There's three, right? It comes later. And that's what he calls perfectibility. You see that towards the end of the text. We have an impulse in ourselves to improve ourselves in our situation. He says most animals, they're content with just living with whatever's around them. They get their food, they live, they die, they do all those things, right? But human beings, we want to improve. We want to make it more perfect, right? So we're not content with just what we have. We want to build a shelter. We want to try to hunt better. We want to try to develop. We develop tools. We develop, and Rousseau calls that perfectibility. We become more perfect. It's another quality of us, right? So to reiterate, independence, Rousseau argues, compassion or empathetic towards other humans, and then perfectible, as in we can progress or improve ourselves to be more perfect. Not necessarily saying that we are perfect or we will be perfect, but that we have an ideal of something being better, and ideally move towards it. And so that is actually what begins to undo our society, undo our, not our society, but undo our freedom and our compassion. Because he says, not that it's a big brute that comes in and takes over society, it's actually the person who invents something first that everyone needs. So, for example, the first person to build a shelter, like a nice shelter. And then people say, well, I want to know how to do that, right? Because I have this thing in me that wants to live in a better condition. I'm not content. Once I see that someone else has built something better, I want that, right? It's just like a tiger or a bear. It's not necessarily gonna, if some other bear finds a nice something, like another bear is not necessarily gonna try to build it or shape it, but humans will. So they're not content. They're like, whoa, that looks really comfortable. Like, then they have to, but I don't know how to do that. So now I have to ask you, how do you do that? How'd you build that? Right? Well, now the person who's invented this new thing has gained power over me. He can say, or she can say, oh, I'll tell you if you do this, if you allow me to do this, if you, right? And that's where inequality starts to begin. It's our very impulse towards progress or changing our environment that begins to make us become unequal, right? And then once we begin to settle down, then we all have houses, we all have food. Then we start to, divide up the land in certain kinds of ways, and certain people start to benefit more than others. Someone says, hey, look, I'm the one who figured out how to build this. So I need to have good land if we're going to live together. Otherwise, I'm not going to tell any more people how to build them exactly the way that I do. Or I'm not going to lend out any tools I have anymore, or things like that. Now, obviously, other people could invent them or develop them, but different inventions are going to develop in different ways for different people. And when new ideas emerge, now people have to come to me and ask me. So we all have houses. When I figured out how to do something else in the house, right? Build it even so it's warmer in the winter. Now people are going to know, how do I do that? Well, now you have to give me some power. I'll say, hey, I'll tell you all if you give me a bigger piece of land. Now we have inequality, right? And that keeps scaling. And eventually, for Rousseau, the main thing that causes inequality, and in fact, a lot of the evils of society, is our dependence. We've lost our independence. We're no longer self-sufficient. If you get sick, generally you can't heal yourself. You have to either pay money, or, you have to pay money either way, but either pay money directly out of your pocket to get a medication that you don't know what's in it, you don't know how it's made, you don't know how to make it yourself, or you have to go to a doctor. But now your health, the health of people you care about, is dependent on you having money. It's dependent on you having something that stores and doctors will accept. And in this society, they won't accept eggplants, right? You have the juiciest, nicest eggplants ever. And be like, hey, I got 5 of these eggplants. They'll blow your mind. If you give me some surgery on my leg, trust me, it's worth it. The doctor might be like, no. Okay, fine. I promise you, every year for the rest of your life, I'll bring you 10 of these amazing eggplants. Nah, doctor's not. You're going to say, I want money, right? I want this particular piece of paper or these coins that allow me to do whatever I want with them. I can even just save them somewhere, right? So now I'm dependent. I have to get this paper or this coin. I can't do something. I can't go out and hunt a deer or offer to protect somebody or whatever skills I have. I have to get money. So now I'm dependent. I have to do what society says I have to do in order to get money. And he says it's that lack of dependency that now creates inequality, right? That lack of independence is what creates inequality, because now I have to function in a system that maybe doesn't want to pay me the most. Maybe I could hunt and make money. I could hunt and feed myself, but that's not what society wants to do anymore. So now I have to get money or coins or something else that's value. And maybe my skills aren't that useful. So If I was taking care of myself, I could hunt deer and boar and forage for mushrooms and do all kinds of stuff. But to get this money, I have to maybe become a laborer or work on someone's farm. And they don't want to pay me that much for that because it's not that valuable. So now we're unequal. Now I'm dependent. So Rousseau says a lot of the horrors of the world, like war and all these things, they wouldn't exist without this coercion. It's really society that makes humans bad and unequal. It's in the context of society that our pure, independent, compassionate nature is not rewarded, and a more scheming, power hungry mode of being human is rewarded, right? Rousseau argues it's only in the context of society that lying becomes profitable and something that can be encouraged and active. So that's where we'll wrap up this discussion for Rousseau. But as we said, there's a part two to this, which is going to talk about race. Because part of what Rousseau's evidence for the state of nature is living indigenous people and African peoples, right? He talks about, he's going to use examples of indigenous people to say, hey, look how they are. They're the state of nature, right? So the reason why I'm putting this Gordon and the Rousseau reading together is because at the same time, right, the same time that they're reimagining what human nature really is, there already is another image of that's already racialized about who's in the past and who's in the present, who's advanced and who's behind. And for Rousseau, African and indigenous people are great examples of what we're like in a state of nature. He says that, primitive people are naturally can deal with animals or can run really fast and all this stuff. And he says that's an example of what humans were like before we've gotten weakened by the advanced civilization we're in. And so, just to wrap up, Rousseau is he's not fundamentally against civilization. His later books he's big fan of democracy, right? Democracy, as with most liberal theorists besides Hobbes, is the ideal form of government, right? And instead of having the will being the king, Rousseau's going to talk about the general will, right? Which is the collective desire or will that the society needs to actualize or advance through democracy. Right, so he's one of the big arguments for democracy because that gives us as much of our independence and power as possible, while still maintaining civilization, right, and allows us to move towards an ideal, more harmonized state. But the next video will be about Gordon and race and how these two ideas and how liberalism itself might have some issues dealing with the legacy of race and racism.